Okay, my name's Evan Mulch, and I am going to start reading this book again. May God Forgive Us. It's about America's betrayal of China to communists by Robert Welch. And anyways, I'm going to read this because most people my age do not read books, but they listen to audiobooks, they listen to podcasts. And this is one that I really think people should listen to. And if they get the urge to, they should read it. And anyways, I'm going to go through this and get as much done as I can right now. And if I don't finish the book, then I'm going to actually continue it at another time. But at least if you listen to this, you'll know part of the book. I'm not going to read everything correctly. I'm not going to pronounce everything correctly. I may reread a sentence here or there because I am not a expert at audiobooks, but since nobody else is doing this, I'm going to do it myself. So anyways, I'm going to share with you where you can buy this book because that's important, because you may want to buy it afterwards. And you could buy it for as low as $9.95 for the paperback version. Okay, so starting out on, so you open the book, you've got the table of contents. You've got this letter right here. It's an introduction to this book. It's dated October 8th, 2019. If you do look at the copyright page, it's copyrighted in 1952, and it's real interesting because 1952 it sold over 110,000 copies, and so that was pretty significant for that time period. So it's not a new book per se, because it's been reprinted, but it's still important today because most Americans have no clue what happened during this time period because they've been taught revisionist history. They've been taught lies because the global elites do not want Americans to know the truth. So here's the introduction to it, dated October 8th, 2019. Imagine China as an ally to the United States, as a country that did not cause the death of upwards of 76 million of its own citizens, and as a Chinese country such as Taiwan that is not socialist and totalitarian but free. If not for influential members of the US government who withheld supplies from the nationalist Chinese forces who eventually moved to Taiwan, while aiding the communist forces during World War II and afterward, that would likely be the situation in the world now. Instead, China is our rival, regularly threatening to destroy the United States militarily, even as it works to destroy us economically. That history of US political subversion is not known to many Americans today, and it was not known by many Americans in the past either. Though much of the Chinese betrayal had been exposed by certain committees of Congress, Robert Welch realized that much of the story and the significance of the events had not been understood by his fellow citizens. Thus, he wrote the book, May God Forgive Us, as a letter in 1951, and got it published the following year. Later, in order to tell the truth about Chiang Kai-shek to the American public, he wrote a biographical sketch of Chiang, which constituted the whole May 1957 issue of One Man's Opinion, the predecessor of American Opinion magazine. This book, again, May God Forgive Us, is a 1971 sequel to the 1951 volume, updated with Robert Welch's 1957 biography of Chiang Kai-shek. Together, the two books had a circulation in the hundreds of thousands. Once China was under communist control, thanks to aid from the United States, it, like other communist countries, was simply a basket case of internal misery: murder, torture, deprivation, and starvation. It, like Soviet Russia, would likely have it, like Soviet Russia, would likely have fallen altogether because of its economic failures, except for socialists and elitists within our own government helping to sustain its economy, encouraging U.S. companies to invest and allow transfers of intellectual wealth, trade advantages, and more. Communism does not work since it goes against human nature and the laws of economics. It must be sustained by outside forces, food, and financing. China's economic success was not accomplished by the Chinese as much as it was by subversive American officials, starting with those exposed in, again, may God forgive us. Many of these people today are part of the deep state. Again, may God forgive us, will enhance your understanding of the entities and people at work to bring America into a totalitarian New World Order, united with socialists and communists around the world. The more you understand of how China went communist and the role of Americans played in that process, the more you will understand what is happening today, vice versa, China. I'm going to read the dedication. The here's a quote. To fear not sensible failure, nor covet the game at all, but fighting, 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 die driven against the wall. End quote. The 250,000 brave patriots of Bohr Komorowski's army, mercilessly betrayed by Stalin, died literally driven against the physical walls of their crumbling city of Warsaw. But there are still harder forms of death in the fight for the very cause rather than the personal enjoyment of freedom against less material walls. Behind the Iron Curtain today, there are still men and women who, with little hope that they will ever recover freedom for themselves, are daily risking torture and death in their increasing secret fight against the enveloping darkness of communism. Without the sustaining excitement of battle, these men and women are willing to buy with their suffering and their lives a tiny breach in the blanket of tyranny. It is to these men and women who, as individuals, are willing even to die, driven against the wall of collectivist suppression for their very beliefs in their dignity and worth and rights of individual man, that this small book is humbly dedicated. There's the small book. A short prologue. The following chapter of history began exactly 20 years ago as a personal letter. And remember, this is written by Robert Welch here. After an incubation period of several months, it appeared as a baby book published by the Henry Regnery Company. During the 1952 political campaigns, the book grew rapidly in reach and muscle. In fact, the wide readership of May God Forgive Us in Texas during the last months of the presidential campaign was given credit by some people for having enabled Eisenhower to carry that state against Adlai Stevenson, thus proving once again that man proposes, but God disposes. For nothing could have been further from the intention of the author, who was a Taft man all the way, than to help the man who, as the head of NATO, had already described himself as 1/12 an American. Actually, however, we cannot credit the wisdom of God for what took place, but must blame the stupidity of men. For Eisenhower ran with great ostentation as an anti-communist. In Wisconsin, for instance, he teamed up with and got the wholehearted support of Senator Joseph McCarthy, the man whom he later, as president, was to do everything in his power to insult, to hamstring, to undermine, and to destroy. For during the campaign, anti-communism fitted the very strong mood of the American people, which may God forgive us in its small way was helping to make even stronger. Adlai Stevenson had been picked by the insiders to make a sacrifice play through running as Eisenhower's opponent, thus causing Eisenhower to show in a far better light. For Stevenson's pro-communist leanings were pretty well known to everybody, while the far more extensive, more effective, more continuous, and more treasonous activities of Eisenhower on behalf of the communist advance throughout his whole career, was still one of the most successful, I'm sorry, it was still one of the most successfully suppressed secrets in all human history. And it's worth noting in passing that Stevenson fully understood the role he had been obliged to play. He even remarked at one point that it only hurt for a while. It is also worth noting that this whole maneuver was in accordance with a brazen bit of strategy which the communists use over and over. Whenever a revulsion against the power and progress of communism starts to gather enough steam to become dangerous to the plans of the top conspirators, they are already prepared to have one of their own men run around to the front of the opposing forces and lead this crusade against themselves. The opposition can then be gradually and cleverly led astray and dissipated, or sometimes even cunningly steered into the service of the conspiracy. And it is, or should be, amazing how repeatedly the public falls into this same trap, always digging its future grave deeper before it climbs out to daylight once again. After taking 8 years to realize that Eisenhower was using the full power and prestige of the presidency to help the communists all he dared, both abroad and here at home, the American people were ready in just 8 more years to be deceived once more in identically the same way by another pseudo-conservative named Richard Nixon. Among those thus deceived and who worked hardest for Nixon's election were many staunch anti-communists who ought to have known better. Because for those who had done their homework properly, the real Nixon record was unmistakably clear. The Blue Book of the John Birch Society, to give one illustration, had exposed the crafty character of Richard Nixon when it was first published in 1959. There were many other sources for the record that had earned him the sobriquet of Tricky Dick. As early as 1947, soon after he had first gone to Congress, and while he was still riding the anti-communist wave which put him there, which got him reelected in 1948, and which enabled him to defeat Helen Gahagan Douglas for a Senate seat in 1950, Nixon was already hard at work feathering his nest in the unlighted communist grove. And he was already associating closely with such veteran pro-communists as Christian Herter, Henry Cabot Lodge, and Earl Warren in some of their behind-the-scenes activities. Always a daring gambler, Nixon used his anti-communist pose and pretenses, even his grossly exaggerated part in the exposure of Alger Hiss, as a brilliant gambit in the political game. He expected it not only to enable him to win his early contest for higher and higher office, but to pay fabulous dividends at some time in the future, when the insiders realized that he was really on their side, but the public still did not. And this calculated risk was certainly proved immensely successful. In fact, it is one revelation of supreme hypocrisy on the part of the President Nixon, which now gives timelessness to the present reprinting of the treatise that follows. His recently announced plan to pay a visit of state to the infinitely cruel, murderous, bestial, and lying regime which holds the population of mainland China enslaved by torture and terror is not only an almost unbelievable repudiation of the campaign promises on which he was elected, but is an unqualified and unforgivable betrayal of the American people. It should prompt many patriotic citizens to look at that long and original betrayal of the Chinese people into the hands of these monsters at Peking by our government, which was fully outlined in May God Forgive Us just 20 years ago. For much has happened and many things have changed on the surface of this suffering globe during those 20 years. But in one area of human activity, unfortunately, there has been no change at all. The heads of our government are still doing everything that they dare, as they have now done steadily throughout the 3 decades, to help the great conspiracy in its determined and ruthless march toward enslavement of the total population of the earth. And no feature of this treasonous activity should bring more shame and more fear of patriotic Americans than the military support, financial support, and moral support which we have given to Mao Zedong and Chow En-lai and their fellow criminals over the past 27 years. So we have pulled a copy of May God Forgive Us out of our permanent files and added it to it our biographical sketch of Chiang Kai-shek, which constituted the whole May 1957 issue of One Man's Opinion, and published this combination as the unpretentious and inexpensive paperback book that you now have before you. Both parts still constitute the very personal kind of message which each of them was when it first appeared. There are a few passages that might be changed in wording and one conjecture, which might be omitted altogether in the light of later knowledge, if the context were being written today. But on the whole, both studies, besides being completely free of factual errors, have stood up very well even as correct interpretations of events about which so much so-called history has been so terribly and deceptively distorted. Also, for those who need reassurance about the professional quality or value of literary fare so unprofessionally produced, maybe we can be forgiven the immodesty of quoting just two significant comments. In 1952, General A.C. Wedemeyer, who had been the commanding officer of all American forces in China during some of the period covered, stated of May God Forgive Us that it was, quote, the most comprehensive and objective treatment of the complex situation in the Far East that I've yet read, end quote. This evaluation appeared on the jacket or cover of all editions published by Regnery. And in 1957, Dr. Hollington Tong, then the ambassador to the United States from the Republic of China, was kind enough to state publicly that our essay was the best short biography of President Chiang Kai-shek that he had ever read. One much too flattering forward about the author, which one of his friends insisted on putting in the original editions of May God Forgive Us when published by Regnery, was omitted in the 1960 edition published by ourselves, and has been omitted here, as have been most parts of the blurbs on and in the jacket of Regnery hardbound copies. But otherwise, the whole original content of both treatises has been reprinted without change or omissions, even as to the footnotes which were added in 1960. And we hope that these impassioned reviews of the steps in our earlier betrayal of Chiang and China, written while the events were still current of recent news, I'll start that sentence over here. And we hope that these impassioned reviews of the steps in our earlier betrayal of Chiang and of China, written while the events were still current or recent news, will prove helpful to many patriotic Americans as some trustworthy background to the still further betrayal by our government that is in the process, by our government that is in process at the present time. Robert Welch. So that's the end of the short prologue. And here's where it begins. So this is the first letter, and it doesn't have to who it was written. It was just a letter that Robert Welch wrote, and so it's dated July 4th, 1951. Dear Mr. Blank, your letter of May 8th was read with careful interest. The delay in this reply was made necessary by a short business trip to South America, 2 candy conventions, and some other business meetings in Chicago, and the pressure of my regular work, for it was clear that only a long letter on my part would serve the need. And not until this holiday have I been able to begin one. At first glance, it seems strange that 2 men of obvious goodwill and of strong patriotic purpose should read the signs of the times so differently. The best that I can do in support of my interpretation of motives and events is to set forth the facts which lead me to the convictions expressed in my Portland speech, to which you refer. I am sorry that I cannot do this in a few paragraphs, for I have to go far afield and build up these facts step by step in order to show the ultimate impact and significance of the partly completed pattern as it now appears to me. In reality, I have to begin 10,000 miles away and 25 years ago. The people of my speech before the New England Council of Young Republicans was Atchison and MacArthur. And sorry, some of the material I drew upon in that talk has since been batted around quite ineffectually in the senatorial investigation. Much of it has not, for as members of the House have charged, none of the senators on the investigating committee either knew or took the trouble to find out the right questions to ask. But more important than this failure of the senators concerned to steep themselves in the background of the situation they were investigating has been the failure of anybody with authoritative knowledge to put together the events leading up to that situation in one connected and coherent story. I do not claim to have any such authoritative knowledge, but I shall use such ability as I can muster to integrate into one readable sequence some of the piecemeal history presented by those who do. It is disturbing. It is a disturbing story, making all due allowance for my lack of skill in assembling these facts. I still do not think you will sleep as well tonight after reading even this amateurish exposition, and it is a terribly important story. I hope that your own serious interest in our whole foreign policy will fortify your patience to bear with me line by line while I present it as well as I can. And that's the end of Roman numeral 1. I'm on to Roman numeral 2, the background in China. Although Lenin himself believed that China would be the first of the world's greatest nations, outside of Russia, to be taken over by the communists in their march to world rule, and the United States of America the last, and although the communists first began to work in China in 1920, it was not until 1926-27 that the results of their efforts became noticeable. By that time, Earl Browder, Michael Borodin, and several other communists had infiltrated into the Kuomintang as advisors and proteges of Dr. Sun Yat-sen or of Madame Sun Yat-sen after her husband's death. Earl Browder is well, if unfavorably, known to American readers. Borodin will be remembered by some as an ex-jewel smuggler, an early agent of the Communist International in this country, and by others as the highly important Moscow functionary of 20 years later, who was liaison official between the Soviet Foreign Office and American newspapermen. Unfortunately for their purposes, Dr. Sun Yat-sen had died in 1925, too early for them to be ready to seize the opportunity thus offered. And although Borodin in particular had played up to General Chiang Kai-shek, the first thing the general did after consolidating his position as Sun Yat-sen's successor to top power in the Kuomintang was to turn against the group of Boers from within. So the communists, with the help of Madame Sun Yat-sen, and while Chiang was on the famous Northern Campaign in 1927, seized the mechanisms of power at the capital city of Hankow and attempted to constitute themselves a central government. Chiang turned back and drove the whole crowd by force of arms in a complete rout out of Hankow. Browder came back to America and Borodin fled to Russia to edit the Moscow News. The first communist attempt on China was completely demolished, but some of its reverberations last until today. For Chiang Kai-shek thus became one of the two men, Franco being the other, who has ever beaten the communists at their own game. There thus began, for reasons that are obvious, the longest and most vicious smear campaign in all history. It is a smear campaign which has colored for the outside world a great deal of what Chiang has done or tried to do ever since. And there thus began at the same time the unholy alliance between Madame Sun Yat-sen and the Russian communists, which has been so harmful to China. Living in Moscow, acting as the goddess of Sun Yat-sen University in that city for the training of these Chinese students in communist tactics and guerrilla warfare, and appearing publicly with Stalin to welcome Chinese delegations. She has been a traitor to China, in fact, if not by intention, for more than 20 years. The second communist attempt on China, the one which has persisted ever since, was started in 1929 by Joseph Stalin, who had already become to almost supreme power in Russia. It has been conducted from the very first with that combination of cunning, ruthlessness, patience, and twisting with times and events that is so typical of this dictator. Stalin began by picking a young Chinese intellectual named Mao Zedong as his agent. By having this agent undergo a metamorphosis of outward characteristics and leaving the cities alone by planting Mao and his handful of helpers in a rural province of China to promote communism under the guise of agrarian reform. It is worth noting here that Mao, trained in Moscow, guided by Moscow, supported at every turn by Moscow, has never been anything but a murderous tool of Stalin, as was well known by most of the traitors and their gullible dupes who promoted the agrarian reform myth for American public opinion. It is worth noting, too, that agrarian reform at its very best, as practiced by the communists, means taking all land away from its former owners, then hauling those owners into people's courts on trumped up charges and sentencing them leniently to having both hands chopped off. Some recent articles in the Saturday Evening Post by a physician who had worked behind the Chinese communist lines were quite factual and revealing. At its worst, agrarian reform means to Stalin the deliberate and literal starvation of some 3 million Ukrainian peasant farmers, and then boasting to Winston Churchill about it 15 years later, as the only way it was feasible to collectivize the farms into plots big enough for tractors to be used. The agrarian reformers under Mao in 1929 proceeded from the very first according to blueprint by forming a Chinese Red Army. Mao's right-hand man was General Chu Ta. His next in civilian command was Chow En-lai. These are the same two men who, next to Mao, are in top command of the communist armies fighting our boys in Korea today. But down in Kiangsi province in the early 1930s, they were not doing so well, and in 1933, Chiang was able to drive them out. Under Chu Ta's generalship, Mao's small forces executed the famous Long March of about 1,000 miles from Kiangsi all the way to the northwest province of Shinsi. There they started the same type of agrarian reform afresh, and by 1937, they were still just a handful of Russian stooges, spreading terror in a limited and trying to get ahead. Then, an entirely new factor changed the Mao-Stalin outlook. Japan felt ready in the march of its confident imperialism to proceed with the brazen conquest of China and began its attack on Shanghai on August 13th, 1937. The threat to Russia and to Stalin's own ambitions from a Japan constantly expanding and growing in military might was very real. What's more, the inevitable confusion that would be caused in China by the invading Japanese forces was exactly what Stalin knew how to use to best advantage. So he ordered his stooge Mao to form a united front with Chiang Kai-shek against the Japanese. And on September 22nd, 1937, the Communist Party announced that its former Red Army had been reorganized as a part of the Chinese National Army. Such an official reorganization did theoretically take place, for Chiang was desperate for all the help and all the Chinese unity that could possibly be obtained to hold off the Japanese. Most of the Chinese Communist armed forces were constituted as Chinese 18th Group Army with about 45,000 men. but it still remained under the command of the same communist General Chu Tae as before. A short time later, the remaining 10,000 armed communists were officially designated as China's new Fourth Army, also under the command of a communist general. For about 2 years until it became clear that China was not going to cave in under the Japanese attack, and probably obvious to Stalin that America would presently be in a war with China, and the Chinese Communist forces did do some fighting against the Japanese and refrained from too much troublemaking for the nationalist forces in China. But they never actually merged with the nationalist armies or submitted to military control by the nationalist command. And from the first, they claimed an autonomy that was inconsistent with any sound military organization or with their own pledges at the time Chiang had accepted the United Front. By the middle of 1939, the situation had become so bad that Chiang told Chow and Lee he was no longer tolerate this. I'm sorry, I'm going to read this again. By the middle of 1939, the situation had become so bad that Chiang told Chow and Lei he would no longer tolerate his pretended autonomy. But by this time, the communists were ready to begin a steady expansion of their occupied area at the expense of civil war in China. And in January 1940, directly disobeying orders from Generalissimo Chiang, the new Fourth Army moved into zones in Anhui province in order to begin establishing a communist corridor from their stronghold in Shanxi all the way to the East Coast. The government had no other course than to disband the mutinous troops. But instead of telling the world what had happened and disclose the conclusive proofs of treason which were found on officers of the captured Fourth Army, the nationalist government tried hard to hush the whole thing up. They thought that such evidence of civil strife would be harmful in their relations with other governments. As a consequence, the communists flooded the press of the world with their stories about Chiang's unwarranted oppression of his communist allies, which were just about as truthful as the usual communist propaganda. But this was only the beginning, and far worse was soon to come. From 1940 on, Chiang was compelled to immobilize some of his own forces so badly needed for fighting the Japanese to keep Mao's communists from overrunning more and more territory. In 1942, after America had come into the war, Stalin felt that he had nothing ultimately to fear from Japan on the Asiatic frontier. In helping to persuade America to neglect the Pacific and throw all of its strength into the European struggle, he had two main purposes. One was to save European Russia from Hitler's armies. The other was to keep the war going in China as long as possible, because every day that Japan's defeat there could be delayed was just that much more opportunity for Mao to increase communist strength in the confusion. So immediately after Pearl Harbor, there was a reaffirmation between Russia and Japan of the Molotov-Moscow Pact. This was something which the Russophiles were careful to keep under wraps at the time, and which they have been trying with remarkable success to have the world forget about ever since. The most important part of this pact was a 5-year pledge on the part of both nations to commit no act of aggression against each other. Here we had been attacked by Japan. Instead of fighting back at our attacker, we were rushing over to Europe with all the military pressure we could exert and all the material of war we could possibly send at whatever expense of lives and money to protect and save Russia in its desperate plight before Hitler's armies. And this Russia we were trying so hard to save not only calmly confirmed its alliance with our enemy Japan, who had attacked us, but used that alliance as a means of crippling more and more of our, I'm sorry, I'm going to reread that. And this Russia we were trying so hard to save not only calmly confirmed its alliance with our enemy Japan, who had attacked us, but used the alliance as a means of crippling more and more our ally China, which was fighting on our side against the enemy Japan, and had already been fighting this same enemy for 4 years. This cold-blooded cynicism of this deal is only less astounding than Stalin's correct assumption that our government would swallow it. So far had the Stalinites already gone through propaganda and treason in influencing our governmental course. The formal result of this pact was a state of complacent neutrality between Russia and Japan for over 3 years. Each could proceed about its own nefarious purposes without worrying about being sideswiped by the other. And in actual truth, the only reason this worked out to the advantage of Russia and to no benefit for Japan was that America happened to be on the side of Russia and against Japan. The chief practical result was the free hand that Stalin thus gave himself and Mao to begin the real dismemberment of China. Mao resumed the civil war in earnest. His forces began infiltrating and seizing area after area in North China. Despite the Molotov-Matsuyama Pact, Mao could still engage in guerrilla tactics against the Japanese. Because of the fiction that the Russians had no control over the Chinese communists, just as Russia maintains the formal fiction that she has nothing to do with Korean fighting today. And there was great propaganda value for Mao, as well as a means of getting actual and direct American help in putting up an appearance of fighting the Japanese. But even his rule of thumb instructions to his generals to devote 30% of their effort to fighting the Japanese and 70% to fighting Chiang finally became valid only in appearance. And of course, the increasing quantities of Chiang's forces that had to be used to withstand this armed communist encroachment far more than offset any damage inflicted on the Japanese by Mao. For by 1945, Mao's army had grown to over 1 million men. In 1937, these communists had controlled territory in Shanxi, with a total of less than 500,000 inhabitants, or about 1/8 of 1% of the population of China. By 1945, they controlled large parts of the populous provinces of Hebei, Shahar, Johor, Shanxi, Shantung, Shaanxi, and Anhui. This had been enabled to do by Japan's attack on China. During the really effective last 4 years of this time, this man Mao had been fighting against our active ally Chiang while we were at war. Yet this is the man that the communist traitors in our midst and their dupes and allies have persuaded us to befriend in every way at the expense of our ally Chiang since 1945. When Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese, worn out and impoverished with 8 years of fighting Japanese invaders, had earned and so badly needed our help and friendship instead of the betrayal we have given them. I'm going to take a break here and we'll move on to Roman numeral 3 during the next video. So I'm on page 8 of this book. You can see in front of you how you can purchase it. All you need to go is to shopjbs.org to purchase the book. Thank you so much for watching this video and learning more about what really happened during World War II. I was always suspicious on what exactly went on in China during World War II, and this book is actually a relief to me because this helps me understand what exactly was going on. Because if you learn anything after studying from the John Birch Society, it may have sounded like we won World War II, but what happened after World War II did not look like, it doesn't look like the United States of America got the winnings from World War II, because what we did is we helped the communists after World War II. Instead of helping to spread communists, or instead of helping to spread constitutional republics around the world, we helped to spread democracies, which, as many of you know, turn into communism. Thanks so much for watching this, and if you're listening to this, thanks for listening to this. I'll try to finish the book at some time. My name's Evan Mulch. You can follow me on Twitter. Evan Mulch is my Twitter name, and you can also call me if you have questions. My number is 864-804-0789. Thanks so much.